Hey everybody, bit of a different video today. In this video, we're going to take a look at the product history of Gate Nouveau 64. Now, of all the modules I've produced, GN64 was by far the, not just largest in terms of the HP on the screen, but largest in terms of lines of code and number of hours spent and total time invested in a single module. So the story of Gate Nouveau really begins with this module called Zum. Well, during the development of Zum, one of the things I kept running into is you can see down here on the bottom there are 8 gate inputs. And at the time, I didn't have any modules that were really good at giving me very precise control over a number of different gates. Now, not long after, on December 30th, I started toying around with an idea. At the time, I was calling this Nouveau, which is an awful name, but we'll just ignore that. Now, the idea behind this module, you can see that there are, obviously it's not finished, but you can see that there would have been 16 steps. And the concept that I had was that each step would allow you to select a note duration. So you can see this first one is a quarter note, and then we have a 16th note, and then a whole note, and then a dotted half note, and so on. And so the idea was to have a gate sequencer that actually allowed variable width gates that were based around musical notes. I never finished this, and I was developing this really on my first month in Voltage Modular, and I kind of had no business developing something like this. It was way, way, way out of my league. So anyways, I played around with it a little bit and ultimately failed, but the idea was still there in my head about a gate sequencer. Now, I wanted to develop some more modules, most notably Funk, and towards the end of the development of Funk, which was kind of at the end of February, I took another shot at a gate sequencer. Now, early on, I was still kind of fishing around for a name. I knew that Nouveau wasn't very good, and so you can see how I went from Nouveau to this idea called GateSeek. So this is the end of February 2021, and you can see the early idea forming here. So up at the top, we have 32 steps. So at the start, it was only 32. You can change the order. And then this row of buttons here was what became known as patterns. And then we had some basic things down here. This is a little bit of a mess because it's an early prototype. Well, I continued to work on that concept. This was the first real usable version that kind of came out of that I actually launched to beta testers for some early feedback. A couple of things that you might notice here is running along the top were these 5 buttons, and these 5 buttons would change what the 32 buttons in the middle here did. For every step, there were 3 layers. There was a step, which is, well, exactly what you think, an accent. Thirdly, there was a ratchet. And the way that this worked is that each step would have these 3 layers, a step, an accent, and a ratchet. And down here, you can see there's 3 different outputs. So depending on what you turned on and off on that layer, you would get an output on each of these ports. Well, shortly thereafter, as I began to use it, one of the things that became fairly obvious early on was that reusing the step buttons for patterns was kind of confusing. I know that a lot of hardware devices do that, but given that this is virtual, it felt like I could just widen the module and put them on there somewhere. But one of the things you notice is that those pattern buttons have now moved out from the step buttons, and they've become their own group of 16 over here on the right side of the module. At this time, I was experimenting with different modes, and this particular video was an early mode that I did that I was calling Screensaver. Here, let's take a look. So here it's going forward, and I'm going to change the mode. So here we are at Screensaver. And we've got the bouncing ball. So that was entertaining, but it wasn't particularly useful. So I ended up dropping that shortly thereafter. That said, I have been thinking about one of these days making a pitch sequencer that has some of those direction modes in them. If you'd be interested in that, you can leave me a comment below. So taking a bit of a closer look at the module, here you can see the interface. A couple of things have changed. A couple of things are emerging now, which is in addition to being able to edit steps, you can see that I'm starting to include ways of generating steps so that you don't have to manually enter everything. Now, all of these modes, Euclid, Repeat, and Nth, I don't think any of these ended up making it into Gate Nouveau. The other thing was they were kind of confusing to use. So Euclid, if you've ever used a Euclidean generator, you probably know that it's important to tell it the number of steps, which the module would know because it would allow you to set its length, but it would also require you to tell it the density. Well, I didn't really have that, and so I did this thing where there was kind of a time delay when you clicked on Euclid, and however many times you clicked it is what it would use as the subdivision. So if you clicked it 3 times, then you would get 3 subdivisions, or if you clicked it 4 times, then you would get 4 subdivisions. There was another feature that was actually in the module for a really long time and ended up getting cut, and that was this save and reload idea. Now, the concept that I had was that once you have a pattern, which again I was calling a state early on, but once you have a pattern, what if it didn't automatically save what you were doing and you had to tell it? What that means is that these 32 steps here, whatever you're seeing in the module, are potentially a buffer, like a temporary state of those steps. That might sound interesting, but it ended up creating some challenges in how the module was used. One of the problems was if you use a step sequencer like this and you click one of the steps on, there's kind of an implicit expectation that you think the module is going to remember that. But if these steps are just a temporary buffer and you were to then navigate over to another pattern and then come back, those changes would actually be lost. In the end, though, this kind of ended up being a little annoying because you would do something and then you constantly, it was like babysitting a little child. You would constantly be having to click the save button. You can hear those ratchets kicking in whenever we hit the yellow steps. So here you can see I'm moving between the accent and the step layer, and those steps are getting brighter and duller depending on which is selected. So if you look, you can see the save button is flashing like I was mentioning. So as the buffer was modified, it's letting you know that it needs to be saved. All right, while that wasn't particularly enjoyable from a musical standpoint, it did give you an idea of how Gate Nuevo 32 was working at this point in time. Probably the number one most influential thing that happened after I recorded this video, I was using Gate Nuevo in a way that was different than I had designed it. I had designed it as a single track with 3 layers, but if you look at the way that I'm routing each of these jacks, I'm actually treating these 3 layers like they were their own track. And that realization made me realize that I probably needed to get rid of this idea of layers and instead go with tracks. So that's exactly what I did. Most notably over here, instead of the step accent and ratchet, now we have 1, 2, and 3, which are representing 3 different tracks. Splat was this idea that I had where it would randomly pick one of the steps in the sequence and it would fill in that step, and then it would fill a circle around it, and then it would randomly pick some other steps nearby to fill in. And the idea was that whenever you did splat, it was like you were dropping paint on your sequence, and anything the paint touched would be a step that got turned on. This was not necessarily my first choice, but it was quite a bit more space efficient. At this time, I was kind of going back and forth with this idea of being able to link sequencers together, and I was experimenting with the idea of using MIDI to kind of pull them all together to kind of have like a master controller type of thing. This ended up not working out, and that disappears shortly thereafter. One other notable thing on this version of GN32 is you can see that the custom buttons now start to emerge. Before, I had been using the stock Cherry Audio ones, and I finally sat down and developed my own set of buttons. And speaking of the buttons, here's actually the complete palette of all of the different buttons that I made for GN64. But you'll notice in these buttons that there's kind of this circular region in the middle. I was really trying to model the look of an LED shining through brightly below it, and then that color of light diffusing into a silicone button pad. Well, anyways, the module was progressing, but at this point, I hit a very interesting crossroads that was almost the end of the module. There was 2 really big problems that I was running into. Number 1, I was having a lot of issues with the timing of the module. The second problem that I ran into is I was starting to see a theme in beta tester feedback. And it was along the lines of, hey, cool, this module works, it's functional, It's not any better than what I have, and I don't think I would buy this. And both of these things really made me stop and think about what exactly I wanted to do with this module and what the purpose of it was. So I made the decision actually to stop working on it. And instead, I started working on a different but very similar module. At the time, I was calling this Time Nuevo. And the idea was to write kind of you can see the text here says clock leader, but it was really to write a central clock, a single point that could be the master timekeeper of your entire patch. This ended up being actually really good for the development of GN64. And just to put this on the timeline, this was kind of about April 2021. What this allowed me to do, number one, is I stopped thinking about Gate Nuevo 64 and I just thought about time. The other thing was, because I was starting this fresh, I actually started from a completely clean slate and I wrote a new clock implementation from scratch. And the number one feature that I wanted of that implementation is that it was dead accurate. And working on Time Nuevo, apart from Gate Nuevo, allowed me to focus really on just doing that well. And one of the things you may notice is that there's an LCD that looks very similar to the one that ultimately ended up in Gate Nuevo. And indeed, that was where the idea for that came from. So I actually still have Time Nuevo. If you would be interested in me finishing and releasing this module, you can leave me a comment below. Anyways, the idea here is that there was 4 divisions and they were each kind of color coded. You can see that there's these different colors on each of them. And as you select a division, then the settings over here change. One of the key ideas here is that for each division, you would pick a musical note. Yes, this is Note-a-Seek coming back again. You would pick a musical note and then you would pick the number of times that you wanted that. So for example here, if I pick some odd division like 1/12, you can see that this is actually what is this? This is an 8th triplet. Well, we could increase the count over here. And so you can see there, if I have 2 8th triplets, then I have a 1/6 note. Or if I have 3 8th triplets, then I'm really getting a quarter note. Well, anyways, Time Nuevo ended up being a really good thing because it allowed me to think about the problems that I was solving differently. So coming back to Gate Nuevo, I actually started over. Here's a screenshot of what that first attempt at rebuilding a gate sequencer after Time Nuevo looked like. If you're looking at this and you're thinking, wow, that's overwhelming, I would agree with you. But regardless, let's just look through this real quick. So at this time, I was still thinking very much in kind of the Time Nuevo context. And so this module was really kind of a hybrid between that gate divider, central clock, and step sequencer. It was kind of trying to be everything. And that was eventually something that I corrected. These modes up here at the top were not entirely the final modes, but they are starting to get close. So Evolve, of course, is in GN64. Quake was one that I really liked and was kind of sad to cut in the final version of the module. What Quake would do is when you pressed it, it would behave like the module was shook left and right. And so your steps would randomly move left and right. Sometimes they would stay the same spot. Sometimes they would randomly move left and right. And sometimes they would move too. That was very rare. And what it ended up looking like is somebody shook an Etch-a-Sketch and moved the steps left and right. Now, I sent this out to beta testers, kind of having taken all of their feedback and sort of having this moment where I really focused on accuracy in the clock. I sent this out to them, and the feedback that I got was, this would be neat, but why would I spend all of this HP and there's only 4 tracks? I really wish this had 8 tracks. This had been kind of an ongoing thing with beta testers throughout this whole project is I would do something and they would be like, can I have a little more? Can I have a little more? Can I have a little more? And I remember just thinking to myself, why not just go all the way? Let's do 16 tracks. Let's double the amount of steps up to 64. And let's just make this the biggest gate sequencer. So with that, I started yet another project. This was probably the 5th major revision of this. Let's take a look at what I had. So you can see we're into May now. So this looks like the sequencer that you probably know. And I recorded this after, I had kind of gotten all of this working with 16 steps and 16 tracks and 64 steps. And this was the recording where I was like, you know what? I think I'm on to something. I think I've got something that people are going to be excited about. Let's just jam out here for a little bit. We're using Zum and some nice Volt filters. There are a few notables here that I want to point out to you. During these last couple of months, May and June, there was a lot of fine tuning. So previously, it was more so searching for the right product. With GN64, I knew I had something that I was happy with, and it was really just about tuning the feature set to be a good combination of things that people would find useful. A couple of things to point out here is there's an expander port. So that expander port that I mentioned, it was kind of a combination of, I had tried multiple link ideas, and one of the beta testers was asking me like, hey, this module is cool, but I want to be able to like program a module that inputs a sequence into Gate Nuevo. And I thought, well, that's kind of like a link, but not quite. And maybe it would be interesting to open it up so that users could program their own generators, or even third-party developers could program a generator and sell it. Well, anyways, what I ended up doing is developing a binary protocol that would communicate over polyjack, and later I made it work over a monojack. It was an interesting technical project, but check this out. This kind of gives a little bit of a demo of how it worked. So you can see here on the left, here's a generator, and I'm going to connect it to the module. And then as I move this knob around, it's generating different Euclidean patterns based on what I'm selecting in the module on the left. Now, what I was just showing there when I moused over this knob is that in addition to dictating where the step was, one of the things you might notice if you look very closely is there is a button here that is not in the final version of Gate Nuevo 64 called prob, and that stands for probability. So here you can see I click it and they all highlight, and then we're able to edit it. I'm going to do that again because that goes by really fast. So let me back up here. So here you can see when probability is on, it would highlight all of the steps that did not have a 100% probability. In this case, what I was demonstrating in the video is that this probability knob from a remote module was able to set that in GN64. And then once you clicked on a step, you would get this editor that's a lot like the gate width that would allow you to change the probability here. Well, anyways, a little bit of time passed, and about mid-June or so, I ended up making the decision to drop the expander port. That combined with a second thing, which is beta testers kept reporting to me that the module had bugs, and I would ask them to send me the patch, and then I would find that they would have probability turned on, and the bug of a step not firing actually ended up being that they had forgotten that they had set probability. What this made me realize is that in this particular form factor, probability was very difficult to make visual. And I felt like weighing the benefit of adding probability for people who want it against the kind of confusion that it caused, it felt like it was going to create more harm than good. So I ultimately ended up cutting it. The one other notable change that happened here was the addition of the MIDI out port in place of a poly out. Made the module a lot easier to work with a DAW because you could just route it back into your DAW and route that into whatever VST you wanted. Well, the other reason was at the time I had been building out a techno hardware Eurorack system, largely inspired by the Erica Sense techno system, and I was using Gate Nuevo to control that. So in this particular setup, I had a Microsoft Surface, and over USB, I was routing that out to MIDI, and then the MIDI would come around into a module called Mutant Brains by Hexinverter, and then that would give me hardware up to 12 different gate jacks that I could then patch into different modules. On June 17th, I created my third attempt at a promo video for Gate Nuevo 64. You've probably seen it. This is playing the Kit Collider patch, also by Rob Gray. Now, one little note here. Right here at the start, you can see that it has this animation that comes in and it says introducing and it has the number 10. The reason that it has the number 10 is because Gate Nuevo was the 10th module that I was releasing to the store. Anyways, I won't make you watch this whole thing. I ended up really liking this patch though. Rob had created it and sent it to me about a couple of weeks earlier, and I felt like it really captured all of the features of GN64 into a single patch, which, by the way, if you're interested in this patch, it is included with the free patch kit for GN64 available on the store. And here at the end, you can see there's his website if you want to go check him out. Anyways, on the weekend of July 4th, Gate Nuevo 64 launched to the store. It was approved right at the end of June, and I shipped it, and the rest is history. So I hope you enjoyed that little walk through how the product development for, which was for me one of the hardest modules that I've created, actually went down. In total, this module, I ended up working on it from February 20th until July 1st. Now, I have still continued to add bug fixes and updates and a couple of features that users have asked for since then, so there's a little bit more time that I spent after the fact. But that initial creation of the module was probably about 130 calendar days, and I estimate about 275 hours of development. I went back and I added up all the lines of code, and it's around 14,000. So this will probably be the largest module that I'll ever do, but who knows, maybe in the future something else will appear. Well, anyways, thanks everybody for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And most of all, I hope you enjoy Gate Nuevo 64 and have fun making your own music with it. Thanks for listening.